Hello, everyone. I'm Marty Willem from Smithers. I'm the IATF sector manager, and this is my second month with Smithers now. So I'd like to welcome you to our virtual auditor training. We've got some presentations set up for you. I've got Brian Keckler joining me. He's going to participate as well and give us some presentations on IAOB findings and other items that are topical and timely right now. So the first one that we're going to look at for me is the risk-based audit days, or RBAD process, that was necessitated by the IATF. So first thing that we're going to look at is the RBAD requirements. So where do they come from? Well, Rules 5th edition, sanction interpretations 26 through 28 were issued in February. So they gave us some lead time on this to try and put together a process to address these sanction interpretations. And it bears mentioning right at the outset that this process really only pertains to the clients that have IATF OEM customers and have scorecards from them that give us the information we're looking for, specifically related to quality and delivery metrics. So what they're looking for is an increase in audit time based on the risk associated with what the client is actually doing in terms of supply of quality and products and on-time delivery. So if the targets aren't met, they gave us a table, and I'll get into these a little bit more in depth, but I would encourage you, if you haven't done so in a while, to go to the sanction interpretations and download them and have a look at what's new and what's different with them, especially being conversant with 26 through 28, where they pertain to RBAD, especially if your clients predominantly would have IATF OEM customers. It bears mentioning as well that one of the new IATF OEM customers is now Geely Group out of China. So it's good to know that group and who that all includes. We've got minimum impact right now, but certainly Volvo is one of the Geely Group customers. So be on the lookout for that with your registered clients. So what we're required to do, and I'll get into this, is the way our process works, but we have to analyze the scorecards from the clients well in advance of the audit happening. And we're setting the bogey at about 90 days so that we can have a look at it and we can plan accordingly, as opposed to having to add time at the very last moment before the audit starts, which will throw things into a bit of a turmoil in terms of your auditor schedules. So we'll try and do this as far in advance as possible. And then the 28 is simply just what the output of this has to look like, and we'll show you what we did with our process and with our forms to address it. So what does SQA's RBAD process look like? Well, as I mentioned, it only impacts clients with IATF OEM customers. We will try to get all of these done as close to 90 days in advance of the audit as possible. What we're looking for is, once those scorecards arrive in the analysis, that any scores for quality or delivery that are less than green, based on whatever percentage bogey the OEM customer has for those two metrics, if they are anything other than green, then we have to add the time according to the table that's been published in the sanction interpretations. So for the most part, this is going to be a back office process. The auditors will be involved from the standpoint of, perhaps if we have difficulty getting in touch with the client, or they're not submitting in a timely manner, or certainly if we do need to add RBAD time to the audit, then certainly we will reach out. You will be notified, and we'll let you know how that's going to work in terms of how much time has to be added. especially if we're going to cross over then into territory where, let's say, an audit was 5 days to begin with, and now we've bridged that gap between a 5-day and a 5.5-day audit, necessitating another auditor being added. So getting these things done as far in advance as possible, if time needs to be added, is paramount importance. In terms of asking the auditors for help, certainly we do want to make sure that we can get information in a timely manner. And especially as we're getting into this process, it just went live on June 30th. So we've got a 3-month gap where these audits happening between June 30th and September 30th, we didn't have the scorecards up front. So as some of you may know already, I've reached out to you to ask you to gather those scorecards from the client for me directly, but we'll get into a more automated process as we move on. So we will end up in a situation as well where we're automatically going to have to add the time if the client is not forthcoming with their scorecards in a timely manner. And by timely manner, I haven't set any specific time, but if it's not within a reasonable amount of time after the email goes out to them, then we will have to just assume that we've got to add the time so that we're not doing it at the last minute. The other thing that we have to consider is deterioration of their management system in some way, shape, or form between when the RBAD analysis is performed and the time that the pre-planning happens, and indeed when the audit itself starts. If for any reason they change from green to yellow or red or whatever other color the OEM wants to use, then we do need to consider that RBAD time. So how are we supposed to use the time?
Martin,
Well,
sorry, this is Karina.
Hi, Karina.
Hi, how are you?
Very
I have
well.
a question. Thank you very much. I'm sorry because I am access late. I was in another meeting. I have a question in the previous slide. What happened if, for example, one of my clients let me know a notification that they lost the VQ 2 weeks or 1 week before to the audit? What I can do? Because this is it's very possible. I had some examples about that.
For sure. And the expectation would be at that point that you send me an email, give me a call.
Okay.
Let me know what's happening, and we'll need to make a backup decision on how to handle it. And again, especially if you need resource help.
Yes, especially for that, I asked.
Exactly.
Sometimes this is difficult. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Okay. So
thank you.
The expectation with the RBAD time is that it's used specifically for the quality and or delivery issues that are causing the reduction in performance against the customer metric. Also, the time needs to be used to look at if there are any risks to other products or processes, and focus always on that particular OEM, but certainly to other OEM customers if there's similar processes in nature, or products are very similar in nature as well. So that's how the time has to be used. It can't be used for anything else. And that could necessitate looking at a bunch of different records, or actually auditing the processes that are involved. Especially if there's concerns about, the actual manufacturing process is proper, then that's where that time needs to be used. But we need to be sure that our objective evidence in the audit report calls out specifically what the RBAD time is being used for, and take credit for the fact that we did it correctly. Now, here's the only caveat, and I guess if you want to call it a bit of wiggle room in this requirement, is if before the audit, the client can demonstrate that they've taken corrective action, and we've got objective evidence of corrective action, not just a plan, but if they've done all of the things that are required for a corrective action, pardon me, root cause analysis, if they've corrected the issue, and perhaps not all of the corrective actions are done, but certainly they can demonstrate that they've reduced the risk, because that's where this all comes from. It's mitigation of risk. If we can show that, and we can have those records available to us, then we can make the decision to not add the time. But it has to be very clear, and we have to have it well documented, because this is going to be a very, very sharp area of focus for IAOB in the next office assessments. Probably, the next 1 or 2 office assessments that we go through, they're going to pick on this, because it is very new process. I shouldn't say pick on it, but they're certainly going to delve into it and say, okay, how did your process work? So, I mean, the good news for us is that we do have what I'm hoping is a fairly robust process to start with, but certainly a process that will become more robust as time goes by. So how much time do we have to add? Well, I mean, it's fairly straightforward. I mean, if you've got a client, and we're going to probably always be in that first row with, 500 or less clients, where we've got maybe 1 or 2 OEM customers, and in more extreme cases where we've got 3 or more IATF OEM customers. But looking at the way that it's spelled out, number of IATF OEM customers where quality and or delivery targets are not being met. So even if we've got a 500 or less employee company that has 3 OEM customers, but only 1 of them demonstrates poor performance, then we're only adding 4 hours. We're not automatically adding the 6 hours. So it seems like a lot of time to add for 1 OEM customer, but that's what the requirement is, and we do have to demonstrate that we use that time accordingly. And once again, as always with any table where there's audit days involved, they are true minimums. By and large, we always stick with the minimums. The minimums become maximums, but we do need to demonstrate that we've used that time and it shows up in the audit plan properly. Pardon me. So I'm going to give you a basic process flow. We are setting up to have an automated email go out to the clients at the 95-day mark before the audit. Pardon me. And this only, again, the BOSS system is set up to recognize clients that have OEM customers, so they will be targeted. We're not going to be sending them out to every IATF 16949 client. So the system is set up for that. Right now, there's a manual process where Colin is actually preparing a list for me, and I'm getting it every Thursday, and I'm adding to my list and keeping track of it, of notifications that have gone out to either the client or to the auditor to help me get the scorecard so I can do that analysis. We've had 2 situations so far where we've had to add time out of the ones that we've targeted. Pardon me, between now and the end of September. So the expectation is that the client is going to respond to us via special mailbox. We do have a communique that went out to all of the clients, and hopefully the auditors have received it as well, which basically explains this process and why it's necessary. Trying to demonstrate that this is an IATF requirement. This is not a Smithers requirement that we dreamt up. So I have access to that mailbox that they'll respond to with their scorecards, and the sector manager, me, will look at that mailbox every day to see if there's new submissions and new scorecards for me to look at. I'm going to perform that review and analysis of the scorecard, take note of anything that is of concern, and I'll prepare what I'm referring to as a duration table that I'll show you here in a couple minutes. If RBAD time is required, I'm going to send that to Lisa so that she can deal with it. If there is RBAD time, Lisa will update the BOSS system to make sure that it shows in there that RBAD time was added. I've got a new little button in BOSS that lets me show that the RBAD process was completed. Not what happened, but just one way or another that it was completed. And that table that I'm referring to, Lisa will forward that off to the auditor so that they can include the time in their audit plan. That email is going to be PDF'd and put into BOSS to be able to show that we communicated with the auditor. And then the pre-planning process starts as normal. Hopefully, like 75 to 60 days before the audit, we're getting more information from the client. Hopefully nothing has changed if they were doing well. But if there is a change and any scorecard is not green, then we are expecting the auditors to notify us, to your point, Karina. We'll determine whether or not, or I will determine whether or not additional time is required, and I'll update Lisa on that, and she'll update BOSS accordingly.
Okay, thank you very much.
So once everything's done and we've determined whether additional time is required or not, the auditor will complete the audit plan. And if there is a table that I send out, or they'll just do it per normal if no table is sent to them. And here's the RBAD table. It's really simple. I'm just taking the table straight out of the SQA 45 so that you got the plan information, and you can see the highlighted the highlighted row that's been added. You'll get this. So the expectation is if I put in a half day of RBAD time there, when you get this email from Lisa, it'll show that in there, and then you can just throw that directly, copy and paste it right over top of the table that's in the template that you've downloaded of the SQA 45. So final thoughts on this process is that the RBAD time, and this question has come up several times, it does not affect the 1/3 manufacturing time. You determine the 1/3 of the audit time being manufacturing based on what the original audit duration was calculated as, not what it gets rounded up to. The time cannot be used for other activities. And as I mentioned before, we've already requested help from the auditors to help us get scorecards that we need between or for audits happening between June 30th and the end of September. But now going forward, I'm looking at them and sending them out as best I can. There are situations where there's gaps in BOSS where some contact information isn't there. So if I ping you to get information about contact details, whether it be email address or a phone number, please be responsive to those so I can keep the ball rolling in terms of the timing bogeys that we have set up. It bears mentioning that this is a new process, and we'll learn as we go. We'll figure this out, and maybe we'll make some changes and refinements to our process over time as we get more adept at doing it. But certainly we will communicate those things across the board to all interested parties, especially the auditors, because you're out there, you're on our front line, and we appreciate the fact that communication between yourselves and the customers is paramount to fostering good relationships with our customers. Or our clients, and certainly the OEM customers. So thank you very much for that one, for joining me for this module anyways for today's activities. Are there any questions remaining on the RBAD process?
Yeah, Marty, I do have one question or point of clarification just on the added time. I thought there was a comment in there about the additional time is before the rounding. So in other words, let's say you're adding 5 hours or 6 hours, because I know some of our Mexico sites are going to fall into the 500 plus range. So let's say you're adding 5 hours. I believe that is before rounding, correct? So it could ultimately add a whole day.
Yeah, that is correct. And
Just wanted to make sure if that was stated somewhere. Of course, you'll probably do the calculations for everybody. So
that's correct. It does state that this increased audit time shall be determined after all permitted reductions have been applied, but before the rounding per 5.2P of Rules 5th edition.
So there may be some cases where that 5 or 6 hours really becomes 8 due to rounding, unless you're at 3.3 or something like that, and it doesn't drastically affect. But I just wanted to confirm that.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, because that could be a deciding factor in how things shake out in terms of audit days and the way the schedule works. Okay, thank you very
Marty,
much.
George here.
Oh, sorry, George, pardon me.
Special scenario. We have a client where we already know that they're in red, and we've already done a special audit under the Red Suppliers Program and all that. And now we have an audit coming up. Do we know whether we still have to add time to that audit? Or because we've already done a special audit to verify.
Yeah, that's a good point, George. And as long as we can clearly demonstrate that we've got objective evidence that, and some perhaps notes of at least initial thoughts on effectiveness of the corrective actions they're taking, and it's specifically related to quality and delivery, then we probably won't need to add the time.
Okay, yeah, so that would fall into that category where we already have evidence of the actions.
Correct.
Unless any new ratings have shown
Correct.
up in red. Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next module.
Okay, everyone, this is Brian Keckler, and in this module for our 2021 virtual auditor training, we're going to be going over the IAOB audit findings. We'll give you an update on findings we had last year in 2020, as well as where we're at currently for 2021. With me today is Marty Willem, our new sector manager for automotive, our general manager Aaron Trausnitz, and a couple of our auditors. So for our IAOB, we have external witness audit and office audits. And some of you may recall back in January, I did send out a summary in an email from January 19th titled Summary of 2020 IATF External Audit Findings. This is going to go over that information again, just to reinforce where we're at with our corrective actions, the expectations that we have of you auditors in response to those. Also knowing that the IAOB will be verifying effectiveness of some of these corrective actions through subsequent office audits and subsequent witness audits. It's good that we're all aware of the actions that we're taking at this point. So in 2020, we did have 10 minors, over 6 IATF audits. 2 of those were from office audits, and I believe it was 4, I'm sorry. Yeah, through 2 office audits and 4 on-site witness audits for the 10 findings overall. So we can proceed to the next slide. One of the first findings we had was an issue with effectively identifying which customer specific requirements will be audited within the audit plan. And more specifically, they really wanted to see it included within the audit plan table, the actual daily agenda. So What we've always instructed auditors to do in the audit plan, there is a customer specific requirements table in section 1.11. You should have always been identifying which IATF customers, the CSRs that were to be sampled during their specific audit. And you should also use that CSR table as kind of your plan to make sure that you do in fact sample all of the customer specific requirements, whether OEM or tier level manuals over the 3-year cycle of the certification period. So that's always been there. We've added a few notes there just for clarification purposes. So we ask you to continue to use that table to identify which CSRs are going to be sampled during the specific audits. But furthermore, in the actual audit plan agenda section, we've made a few changes to at least include a general statement or reference to the CSRs that are being sampled. And you'll see that just a little bit here. But as always, the emphasis is on IATF OEM specifics. And we've added references generically to sampling of the other tier customers. And another note on this as well, we've all started using the new CARA reporting, and you do see within each of the process summaries, there is now a dedicated field for where you actually report objective evidence of the CSRs that were specifically covered. So a lot more emphasis on making sure that we do effectively utilize the customer specific requirements during the audit. And it all begins with your audit planning and putting that information into your audit plan. So you can see here, the first table on the left is the typical CSR customer table where the first part identifies if there are IATF OEMs. We have added Geely Group to that list as well. And not provided in this example, but we'll go over the some of the other document changes later, but keep in mind Geely Group is new. And if they have other automotive customers, in the bottom half of the table, those should also be identified. And then you can use this table as a tracking mechanism to show which ones you're sampling over the course of the audit cycle. In this particular case, this client is on a 6-month interval. So my plan with this would be to probably sample 3 CSRs over each audit to try to make sure I cover the 3 OEMs as well as the other tier customers that have manuals as well. Where the IAOB wanted to see more evidence was in the actual audit plan. And frankly, they were pushing us to try to identify it within each of the processes that were being sampled. We pushed back a little bit and we kept it a little bit more generic, but we did add some information within the day 1 of the agenda. Shortly after your pre-audit planning block, we added a note regarding the customer specifics. So the ones that you've identified previously back in section 1.11, we ask you to carry those over into the actual agenda, note those again. And I didn't show it here, but I believe at the bottom, we also added a generic statement to say something to the effect that documents, records, and CSRs are to be sampled throughout all the processes that are identified. But this at least puts this forward into the agenda so that auditors are a little more aware of which customer specifics they're identifying up front. Some auditors I have seen go as far as putting it under each of the processes. We're not asking you to break it down to the specific CSRs. Initially, there was some debate on IOB wanting us to try to put specifics of FCA specifics for clause 8.3 within the specific process that you're auditing. But I think the specific evidence is you'll be showing more so when you do your actual audit report. And that's kind of how we're going to monitor the effectiveness of this. We're asking that you identify the CSRs, but also then if you go to the next slide, when we do the package reviews within CAR, you can see that each of the processes has this generic question about description of the customer specific requirements that were to be audited. So on this particular example, overall, I was focusing on FCA, Bentler, Cummins, and Canadian electrocoating, also Flexingate. And I made a comment that I did obtain electronic copies of those CSRs in the pre-planning. In fact, if you go back one slide in that regard, one of the things that we did add, go back one slide real quick here. One of the things that we also added to the agenda was a generic statement. Shortly after your opening meeting, we recommend that you take a moment to gather those selected CSR documents, either in your pre-planning time before the audit or shortly after your opening meeting, especially for the lower tier manuals. We do have access, obviously, through the IATF online portal to the OEM specifics, but it's the lower tier manuals that you may have to gather those from the client. So we put that in there as a reminder to obtain copies of those from your customers so you can utilize them during your audit. And then the evidence would be on the next slide. As you document each process that was audited, do your best to indicate evidence of examples of the CSRs that were audited within each of the specific processes. So in this case, I was auditing APQP and design, and I ended up looking at a Bentler project. So I made more specific comments. You can see specific to Bentler and some of the specifics in their manual that I referenced under certain clause numbers. So, so this was just intended to be an example where you would show more specific evidence within the actual CARA audit report of CSRs that were actually sampled. So it's one of the things we'll be looking for as we do our audit package reviews relative to coverage of CSRs. Okay, the second finding that we had last year with the IOB was regarding lack of compliance to IAF communiques. This had to do with the pandemic, the global waivers and measures in response to the coronavirus pandemic, regarding extending the expiry dates on certificates if we revise them, and lacking notes to explain extensions within the IATF database. So this finding is primarily an office-related issue. It doesn't necessarily impact auditors. It was more of a management issue in how we were deciding to extend the certificates, and ran into some situations where we hadn't properly extended the expiry dates after revising the certificates. So within the IATF database, all the certificates were actually extended for a 6-month period. We can see that information in the office, but we were not required necessarily to extend all those dates within our own internal database. So you won't see those extension dates within BOSS. And we were not required to reissue all certificates. We were only required to update certificates in cases where we had a reason to revise the certificate for some reason. And in those cases, we were required to extend the expiry date. So we had not properly done that, so we've addressed that issue internally within the office. So I'm just mentioning it here to auditors for an awareness. We're pretty much getting through most of that extension period now as we're going through the research cycle for a lot of clients now, but it may come up that some of your clients may be aware of the fact that their certificate is technically extended. But the note here that all auditors really should be aware of is that this does not in any way extend the recertification timing requirements. So it's still the recert having to be conducted from the end of the previous recert, 3 years. That was clarified in the latest IATF pandemic guidelines. So though, just because the certificate may have actually been extended, it does not mean that their recert date is extended. So that would only occur if there were special circumstances related to some kind of COVID impact where we couldn't do the recertification within the normal timing. So again, just more for auditor awareness on this particular finding. Okay, our third finding had to do with use of the process FMEA document during the IATF audits. During a witness audit, the auditor did not effectively use the process FMEA. The auditor did have access, but it really wasn't used. They had obtained a copy, but they really didn't demonstrate that they reviewed it or used it during the audit of manufacturing. So one of the things that we did do was revise our SQA 05 IATF specific requirements, which is basically our audit check sheet. And basically all we did was provide some guidance type documents, some guidelines on how we would expect you to try to utilize both the control plan and the process FMEA during your audits. Your audit notes and records should demonstrate evidence that you did in fact use both of those documents. So in your CAR reporting, you should be making reference to the control plans and FMEAs. We at times would ask you to submit partial or completed control plans and FMEAs as part of your auditing objective evidence. Especially, I think the idea would be to provide more of that evidence within the audit report, but we're basically going to be looking for evidence that you did in fact utilize the control plans and FEMAs as part of our reviews of the audit packages and of the CAR report. So along with this update to the check sheet, we gave some suggested approaches that could be utilized. Before you go out into manufacturing, you may want to take a moment to do a quick review of the process flow, the FMEA and control plans prior to actually stepping foot onto the shop floor, looking for things of consistency of how the processes are identified. Process steps and sequences should be consistent from between those three documents. Looking for areas of high severity, identification of special characteristics, looking at how they've identified the failure modes, occurrences, evaluation of subsequent RPN numbers, things like that you could do briefly before you actually go out onto the floor. And you may prioritize a couple of those areas to focus on in more detail if there is areas of high severity or high risk. So also you may want to verify recent corrective actions where there have been failure modes to make sure that they've included those within the control plan and FMEA accordingly. When you're out in production, you might ask production personnel, are they aware of any recent customer complaints? Ask operators how they check for product and process parameters and verify that back to the control plan and the FMEA to make sure there is in fact consistency. If you see other checks and risks that are not identified, compare those to what's on the FMEA and control plan. So again, the key here is to make sure that you are in fact using both the FMEA and the control plan. I know there's definitely an emphasis on utilizing the control plan during the manufacturing audits, but also make sure that the client is using the process FMEA even during their own internal audits of manufacturing. So you can question the auditees themselves, the operators or process technicians, setup personnel, quality inspectors on what some of the risks are, and make sure that you're comparing those responses to what's on the control plan and FMEA. So basically just some basic instructions here, verifying work instructions that they are in fact derived from the control plan and FMEA, overall consistency of the acceptance criteria, the process controls, and the monitoring controls that they've identified in their control plans and FMEAs. All right, next slide, please. Okay, our next finding had to do with the process for writing audit findings during the IATF audits. The auditor failed to write a finding for several cases of missing information on the client's in-process inspection reports during the audit of production. So there was missing or incomplete information. Failed to write up a calibration finding for gauge block, one of the 81 blocks that was found to be out of tolerance. There was no evidence or no evaluation of that out of tolerance condition. Also MSA study that was not to the AIAG guidelines. In this case, it was missing the NDC value, number of distinct characteristics. So I think what we've seen, and there's 2 or 3 findings in here that we're going to go over, that the IOB is expecting us to write findings, even if it's one-off occurrences and things like that. If it's a violation of the requirements, it should be a finding. And if we're missing those as auditors, shame on us for not writing those. And really, the quick answer to this one basically is write the findings. If you're doing an IATF audit, we did training back in April on soft grading, and I think this is part of IAOB's effort to kind of also raise the bar and make sure that as auditors, we are in fact writing the findings that we should be writing during these witness audits. So we can't really monitor you very well on this. This is something where we have to rely on auditor performance to make sure that you are doing a thorough audit. So make sure that you are writing the findings, effectively tracking those findings during the audit, especially if you're being witnessed. Keep good track of how you're following up on your audit trails and how you're tracking the findings. Again, refer to the training that we did recently on soft grading and effective nonconformity management. If you go to the next slide as well, a similar finding, the process for writing detected nonconformities against the client's defined criteria. There's some issues specifically with lacking evidence of the weld parameter verifications that was missing information on the incoming inspection logs. So these both came within the same audit. So they were very similar findings, and our response to both of these were pretty much the same. If we see evidence of auditors not writing appropriate findings, one of the things that we're trying to do is take a look at that when we do our own internal witness audits. It's very hard for us to monitor that any other way, really. We're relying on the auditors a lot in this, and in the case of these 2 findings, to do the right thing and write the findings where they're appropriate. So, next slide, please. Okay, this had to do with our process for reviewing feedback from interested parties. I believe this was an office audit in China, in particular with CNCA feedback, which is on their local website there. So again, this is more of an office audit. Finding doesn't necessarily affect auditors. It just has to do with feedback from interested parties that we as SQA management need to add to our management process in our management review. So the only application that I could kind of link this to you as auditors would be the fact that when you're auditing the client's management review, they should also be identifying any external or other interested parties and reviewing any of that related feedback during their own management reviews. So again, mostly an office audit finding, but I tried to relate it back to interested parties that you might see during an audit as well. Okay, again, this is process for assessing management was not effective during the witness audit due to 2 issues. The appropriate auditee or the process owner or a qualified backup person was not available during the audit. And the audit of management review topics was not effective. They missed some key points. So one of the things that we did to address availability of the appropriate process owners or backup personnel was to make a revision to our audit plan template. We emphasized to the client the need to have the appropriate process owners available, or as we said, qualified backup personnel. And I believe that was part of the issue here. The people that they had assigned as backup really couldn't answer the questions that led to some audit trails that were not able to be effectively followed and missing information that was not effectively evaluated. So it led to this finding. So we've added a note to the audit plan template. When you do your pre-planning and your review of the audit plan with the client, ask them the question, have they identified appropriate process owners? In your opening meeting even, you may want to ask that. After you review the plan with the client, ask them if they see any conflicts. Do they have the appropriate people available to make sure that we get through the process that we need to during the audit? As I said, this can be confirmed again when you review the plan in the opening meeting. If for any reason a process cannot be effectively audited due to the client not having the people available, then this very well should probably lead to an audit finding. There are some cases perhaps during the first surveillance where we might be able to accommodate that and cover it in more detail at a second surveillance, but during initial audits and during recertification audits, we need to make sure that we can effectively audit all the required processes. So this very well could have been a major finding on our part against the client. It could require us to go back and do a special audit to make sure that we can in fact cover the missing information. Next slide, please. And this is where we added the note in the section 2.4, just under the agenda. There's a note that's highlighted. It's intended to be there for the client to make sure that they've identified the process owners that need to be available for us to be able to follow the automotive process approach and to effectively audit the process. So please make sure you ask that question in your opening meetings. Confirm that they have the appropriate people available or knowledgeable backup people that can help cover the requirements. Next slide, please. So this finding had to do with audit finding management was not effective. Specifically, there was an example of a process revision that was observed during the audit, and it was not written as a nonconformity. So again, this was another case of an auditor not really writing a finding against the client for something that was observed as a nonconformity. The client had made a process change in manufacturing, and it hadn't gone through the appropriate change management, change control processes, or through an approved deviation. And in those cases may also require customer approval if you're deviating in the process. So it was a case of an uncontrolled change that should have led to a nonconformity. We're relying on auditors in this case, again, to know the requirements and write the finding when you see these kind of things. Okay, so a lot of this was summarized in my email, but again, I highlighted 8 of the 10 findings that really were aspects that the auditors can control in part or wholly responsibility of the auditor. So some of these definitely could be prevented if the auditors are doing a thorough, comprehensive audit. So the 8 that were highlighted in yellow are the ones where you auditors have the biggest impact. So we've seen the trend I mentioned earlier in the last couple of years. We have seen an increased emphasis through the witness audits where the IOB is really hammering us for missing information, missing requirements, or not writing findings that we should be writing. So I think that points back to IOB raising the bar again. As I said, 3 of them were very similar, things that really are out of our control where we're relying on the auditor to properly identify findings. Because they were similar, fortunately though, we didn't get those issued as repeat findings. So we didn't have majors in those cases, but there's definitely a risk there if they keep writing us up on these kind of things. We're just asking auditors to do a better job of making sure that they're not soft grading and writing nonconformances as appropriate. Two of them had to do with not fully auditing the process. One was in management review. Another one was in the shipping area, I believe, where they didn't fully audit the process. So a couple of them had to do with missing key IATF requirements, such as management review inputs, all things that we can control as auditors. So there was another important one related to the CSRs. Again, that's, you can see from the CAR reporting that the auditing of CSRs has been a huge emphasis with the new CAR process summary format. So based on our training from the soft grading, we're essentially asking you to kind of raise the bar for 2021. IOB expectation is that we do find findings during these audits. So I always say that the IATF standard is a target-rich environment. Not that we're going out there creating or writing findings for finding's sake, but there's definitely plenty of opportunities on most of these IATF audits to identify nonconformities. So, so again, just try to emphasize those things that we can control as auditors, and understand there is a risk if we fail to write findings, and there's ultimately a risk to the customer for failure of noncompliance to the standard requirements. So keep that risk factor in mind when you're evaluating findings. Okay, so as far as 2021, this is just a listing of where we're at so far. Excuse me, where we're at so far as our audits that have occurred. We have had a couple of source directed witness audits for red suppliers. Those really do not lead to nonconformities, but it's more of an oversight function. But we have had one witness audit in the United States. There was one minor from that, and Marty's got a subsequent presentation where we're going to go into that one in more detail. We've also had one witness audit in China. And if you go to the next slide here, we did have one ad hoc major, more of an office issue with IATF database timings. The ad hoc major had to do with a IATF database timings. Anytime we miss timings or don't meet the database metrics, it's pretty much an automatic major. Had to do with a letter of conformance file that had transitioned from a LOC to a full-blown IATF certificate, and we missed the timings within the IATF database. So for auditor awareness, if you're doing any audits with LOCs, these are now all being entered in the IATF database, even the initial LOC audits. So all the normal timing requirements do apply, whether it's an IATF certification audit or if it's just for a letter of conformance audit. So the fact that we are now entering those in the database, we have much more awareness of those during the office. So again, the one minor per the US witness audit, we do have a subsequent presentation on that. And there were 4 findings in China. One of those at the moment is classified as a major with 3 minors, and we're actually appealing 3 of those findings at the moment, including the major. So based on the results of the appeal, we'll probably give some subsequent feedback to auditors on any corrective actions that we're taking from that audit. Next slide, please. This is the one finding so far that we have in the US, and I'm not going to go into detail on that here. We'll let Marty cover it in more detail in the next presentation, but it basically deals with how we go about verifying previous audit nonconformities for ongoing effectiveness. So we'll go into that in more detail in our next module. This is just some of the detail on that, but again, okay, and that is actually part of my other topics, so I think we're okay there as well, Marty. Yep, okay. I think that takes us to the end of the presentation for the IOB audit findings that we have. Are there any questions from anybody in the audience here? All right, then if there are no questions,
Straightforward and clear. Thanks very much, Brian. I'll end this recording here and we'll see you in the next video.